All right, so for our fourth lecture here, we're going to be talking about environmental racism, and this is the first of two lessons on this topic. So we're now making a shift from talking about kind of the concept of justice in general to digging into a series of specific cases in which you often see environmental justice issues coming up. So that's going to kind of take us through the rest of the semester. We'll be looking at particular types of issues that raise environmental justice questions. And so we're starting with the kind of classic environmental justice issue of environmental racism. If you remember from our first lesson, that was actually the original term before it was broadened to environmental justice to encompass a larger variety of kinds of issues. So we're going to start by going through some terminology that we want to make sure to recognize. Then we're going to talk about what is racism. Then we're going to look at the phenomenon of residential segregation, where people of different races end up living in different neighborhoods. We're going to look at the roles of things like housing discrimination and gentrification in creating the pattern of residential segregation that we see. And then we're going to talk at the end about discriminatory siting. So when bad things in the environment, these locally unwanted land uses, get put in certain locations, is that a discriminatory process? Are they being kind of targeted at certain neighborhoods? Okay, so to look at some of the terminology. So first, I think it's important to remember that the language that we use constructs our world as well as describing the world. And that's especially true when we're talking about a phenomenon like race. So there is no biological reality behind the divisions that we make in our society between different racial and or ethnic groups. There's not any way to say, well, this is what the real way of dividing people up is, and then make our language match that division. The language is constructing the categorizations we have in our society, as well as trying to describe the ones that we've socially constructed already. And so when you're looking at specific case studies, you're digging into a particular place and the particular issues that are happening there, you should be paying attention to the kind of language that people are using to describe themselves and to describe other people, to see how they are drawing boundaries, shifting boundaries, bringing people together, distinguishing people with different experiences and all those kind of things, because this is an ongoing and active process of figuring out how we're going to talk about people, how we're going to describe the different identities that are relevant to different sorts of issues. There's never going to be a sort of final word on, okay, these are the terms you should use for these groups of people. That's it. Use the right terms and you're all good. It's always evolving, always changing. The things that, we say today are going to look extremely outdated and sort of cringy in 20 or 30 years from now. But we're going to kind of talk about where we are right now in the development of our society and our way of looking at these kinds of issues. So I want to start with the term people of color. So this is going to be a term that's probably going to come up a lot in this class. This is an umbrella term for people who are not white. So people of every other race aside from white can get grouped together under this umbrella term of people of color. And so this term is intended to give a positive rather than a negative framing, right? Saying not white is a negative framing. It's defining people by what they aren't. So people of color is meant to be a sort of a positive framing. And the idea is to suggest sort of solidarity among people of these different races, that the kinds of racism that they experience are linked to each other, and that they should care about each other's struggles rather than being divided up, the black issues over here and Latino issues over here and Native American issues over here, and so forth. So that's the idea behind having this umbrella term. But it's also important to remember that if you're talking about one specific group within that people of color umbrella, you should use the term for the people that you're actually talking about, rather than saying people of color. Right? If you're talking about black people, say black people. Don't say people of color. People sometimes use this term people of color as this kind of euphemism, as if it's like somehow less racist to say people of color than to name specific racial groups. But if you're talking about specific people, use that term, because the issues faced by black people are not exactly the same as those faced by Native Americans or Asians or whatever other group. So if you're getting specific in the issue you're dealing with, be specific in your terminology. Then we're now seeing more people starting to use a kind of second generation term built off of this, where it's BIPOC, or pronounced BIPOC, which stands for Black, Indigenous, and People of Color. And so this refers to basically the same set of people, but the idea behind this new term is to get away from the way that the term people of color can be kind of homogenizing, can suggest that everybody under that umbrella is basically the same or experiences the same kind of issues, when in fact that's not true. That the kind of racism that would affect a black person is going to be different than the kind of racism that would affect an Asian person, and so forth. And so this BIPOC term kind of separates out some of the people under that umbrella and calls special attention to black and indigenous people as being two of the groups that tend to suffer the worst effects from racism. So it's kind of highlighting the status of those particular groups within that people of color umbrella. So that term is getting used more and more these days, so you should be aware of what that's referring to. Then another set of terminology that we need to talk about is the concept of Hispanic or Latino. So let me move my face so you can see all my bullet points there. So that term comes from the U.S. Census. That's the terminology used in census data. And so in the census, this is an additional category or an additional question separate from the race question. So when you're filling out a census form, or you're filling out any other sort of form or survey that uses the same question format that the census does, which is very common in research to use the same questions that the census uses so that you can match your data up with census data for comparisons. So the census asks about race as one question, and then it asks yes or no, are you Hispanic or Latino? And if you say yes, then they ask you to be more specific, like are you Mexican, are you Puerto Rican, etc. So that's kind of how it's set up in the census and how that data is collected. But what you'll often see in analyses that are done using census data or data collected on that same format is that this Hispanic or Latino category will be broken out and treated as an additional racial category. So you'll get a comparison of Hispanic or Latino people versus non-Hispanic whites, non-Hispanic blacks, non-Hispanic Asians, etc. They'll take everybody that checked yes on that and make them one category alongside these other ones, which is convenient for doing statistics. If you can reduce all of the complexity of people's racial and ethnic identities down to a single variable, that makes your statistics easier, but that doesn't really describe how things necessarily work in the real world. That people will often have Latino and another racial identity together that describe kind of who they are and how they move in the world. So this is a thing that you're going to see when people do research, but it kind of oversimplifies the way that identity works in the real world. Another thing to keep in mind with this label is that not everybody who comes from or has ancestors from Latin America identifies as Latino or Hispanic or whatever other term. This is especially true for indigenous people from Latin America. So, these terms imply a connection, cultural connection to Spain and Portugal, right? But if you are an indigenous person, your connection to that culture may be primarily one of having your indigenous culture being wiped out or overrun by this imported European culture, right? And being forced to learn to speak Spanish when you had your own indigenous language. So not everybody that's from that part of the world would necessarily categorize themselves as Hispanic or Latino. And then I also make note there of the terms Latinx or Latine, which are becoming somewhat more popular these days as gender-neutral alternatives to the term Latino. So for those of you that have studied any Spanish, you know that this is a language with grammatical gender. So terms for people, like Latino, come in masculine and feminine forms, right? So Latino is the masculine form, Latina with an A would be the feminine form. And according to the official rules of the Spanish language, if you have either a group of people of mixed genders, or you're talking about people whose gender is not known, then you would use the masculine form. That's the official rule in Spanish grammar. But just like people have challenged the idea that in English, the term like he or man could apply to people of all genders, people have challenged that within the Spanish language as well, and have developed these gender-neutral alternative terms. They're not universally accepted among the people that they would apply to, but they are terms that you'll sometimes run across, so you should be aware of what they mean. Okay, so now let's talk about what racism is. And there are two somewhat distinct things, related but distinct things, that the word racism gets applied to. And I think it's important to recognize this distinction and to be clear about what you're talking about if you use this word. So one thing that we sometimes apply the term racism to is racial prejudice. So this is an individual's beliefs or feelings or behaviors that involve hostility towards or inferiority of a particular racial group that it's directed towards. Okay, so this is on an individual level, being prejudiced towards people of a particular race. And this racial prejudice may be explicit or implicit. That is, people may consciously believe in a stereotype, for example, that they have about people of a certain race. And, if you ask them, would say, yeah, well, I think people of this race are like that. There'd be a conscious, explicit holding of this, though they'd probably deny that it was racist to believe this, but they consciously hold these beliefs or feelings. And then there's implicit racism, where somebody believes that they don't hold any sort of prejudice, and yet if you were to look at their patterns of behavior, you'd find them exhibiting bias against people of a certain group because they have sort of an unconscious set of beliefs or habits that lead them to act in this sort of way. So both of those things, both explicit and implicit racial prejudice, exist in kind of two sides of this aspect of racism. And when we talk about racial prejudice, when we're looking at the individual level, it's very common. People get defensive about it. Nobody wants to be called a racist. Nobody wants to believe that they exhibit racial prejudice. And people often want to try to turn this into a debate about their character. So sort of intrinsic features of who they are as a person. And so you'll get things like the expression, "I don't have a racist bone in my body," and that implies that being racist or not racist is about these enduring characteristics of who you are. And so I think it's useful to keep in mind this saying that I've got here that comes from a very popular video by Jay Smooth, where he said, it's what you did, not what you are. So keeping the focus on what people do, their actions, which people do actions all the time and can change their actions, rather than getting pulled into a discussion about whether racism is kind of an intrinsic feature of a particular person's character. So racial prejudice is one dimension of racism. It's one thing people mean when they use that term. The other dimension to racism. And for our purposes in this class, which is a social science class, this is in a lot of ways the more important aspect of racism, the more important dimension of racism, is structural racism. So this is social systems and institutions and practices that result in disadvantage or harm towards certain racial groups. So this is going, rather than the individual level, we're looking at the structural level. We're looking at how society is put together. And structural racism is often caused by racial prejudice, and again, moving myself out of the way there, is often caused by racial prejudice of the people that make up these social systems and institutions. But it's not always able to be reduced to just racial prejudice on the part of the individuals that make up those social systems. That the system itself can have these biases built into it in ways that go beyond the behavior of just the individuals in that. So another way of looking at this structural racism is captured by this quote by Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who's a geographer that has worked on the geography of race and racism for a long time. She describes or defines racism as the state-sanctioned or extra-legal production and exploitation of group-differentiated vulnerability to premature death. So I want to, highlight this particular definition because it gets, really explicit about the outcomes that we have from structural racism. So we have these, she's describing it as either state-sanctioned, that is something that is a product of the laws that are in place within the society, or extra-legal. It could be stuff that's happening outside of the framework of the government, and it produces and exploits. So somebody is benefiting from perpetuating these racist systems, right? This isn't just a thing that happened and where did that come from, right? People are actually benefiting from marginalizing certain racial groups. And that the end result is vulnerability to premature death. And so when we're talking about environmental justice, often what we're talking about is things that are going to make people die, right? If we're talking about different risk levels of cancer, well, people are going to get cancer and die, and certain groups of people may be getting those cancers at a higher rate than others. So, this has really serious consequences for people. And then the last point that I note there is that within U.S. society as it exists today, white people will not experience structural racism, or they won't be on the receiving end of structural racism. So racial prejudice might in some cases be directed towards white people, right? There are individual people who may hold, on an individual level, some sort of hostility or bias towards white people, but that does not become a structure within our society, right? That doesn't become a structural pattern within society. That remains only at the individual level of racial prejudice. Okay, so now we can bring geography into the picture here. So environmental racism is the situation in which some racial groups experience worse environmental conditions than others. And given what we've said about structural racism, that means that white people are experiencing better environmental conditions, people of color experiencing worse environmental conditions. That's what constitutes environmental racism. And this is possible, and it's possible to have different environmental conditions experienced by people of different races because people of different races live in different places. If we didn't have distinct white neighborhoods, black neighborhoods, Latino neighborhoods, etc., then we wouldn't be able to, say, put a toxic waste dump in a place that is going to affect our black population more so than it affects our white population, right? If people were evenly mixed in all areas, then bad environmental conditions and good environmental conditions wouldn't have different effects on people of different races. So we're now going to be looking at how that residential segregation, or the separation of people into different places that they live based on their race, comes about. So first, just to see this phenomenon in action, this is a map using 2010 census data of Pittsburgh, where it's colored in based on the race of the people here. And so this is an example of what I was saying earlier of analyses that take that Hispanic or Latino category and pull out everybody that checked yes and make them kind of another racial group alongside the non-Hispanic members of the other groups. So you see, the orange dots here would be Hispanic, and it's hard to see on this map because Pittsburgh has a fairly small and also relatively dispersed Hispanic population. We don't have major Hispanic neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. You'd see something very different if we had a map like this of, say, Tucson, Arizona. So what you're seeing here, and I'll try to describe this in case any of you are colorblind and can't quite make out the dots here. So most of the area of Pittsburgh is predominantly inhabited by white people. So most of the area, and especially the areas as you get farther out into the suburbs, are predominantly white. Then we've got some concentrations of the black population in areas like the north side, Allentown. We've got the Hill District here. We've got East Liberty and Homewood. And if you're from Pittsburgh, you probably recognize these as neighborhoods that are, some of the well-known black neighborhoods of Pittsburgh. Then we've got concentration of Asian population here in Oakland, so around Pitt and CMU. That's one of the major areas where we see Asian folks living in Pittsburgh, but Pittsburgh is, the biggest divide is between the white and black residents of Pittsburgh. And as we're looking at this map, we see that it is very segregated. You look at the Hill District here, and you see almost entirely the green dots representing black residents. You see very few dots of any other color. Whereas when you look at, say, there's my pointer, there we go. When you look at, say, Lawrenceville here, it's very white. It's all blue dots there, right? Or out here, I live in Bellevue, and it's a very white community, and you can see that on the map, that it's almost all blue dots up here in Bellevue. There are only a few areas of Pittsburgh where you see a real mixture, right? Where you see an area that has people, substantial numbers of people of multiple races. And one of those areas is actually parts of the north side here. It's one of the few areas where you can really see a mixture of the blue and the green dots. But even those areas that are mixed, they're often mixed because they're in transition, right? It's not a long-standing, stable, multiracial community, but rather it's an area that was formerly predominantly inhabited by people of one race and is in the process of shifting over. So in the north side, you're seeing some mixture there because this used to be a predominantly black area and is in the process of shifting to becoming a more white area of the city. So we can see the residential segregation on a map like this of Pittsburgh. We can see how we have distinct neighborhoods, some inhabited by white people, some inhabited by black people, and of course, if we're looking at other cities, there'd be major neighborhoods, perhaps of Asian, of Hispanic, and so forth. So why does this occur? Well, first we can talk about how we conceptualize what residential segregation is. How would we measure how segregated an area is, right? We can look at that map and kind of eyeball it and say, yeah, it looks like, most neighborhoods have mostly people of a certain race in it. But there's a number of actual measurements that we can do if we take this data and we put it into GIS. So those of you that are into GIS may be able to run some of these analyses in ARC. So we can look at evenness. So are people of different races distributed similarly across the region? We can look at exposure, which is how likely are you to run into someone of a different race in your neighborhood? Right, so if I go outside my door and walk around Bellevue, how likely am I as a white person to bump into someone who's not white within my neighborhood? Then concentration looks at what proportion of the area within the region that you're looking at. So we're often looking at like a metro area, right? Like Pittsburgh and its immediate suburbs. What proportion of that total area is occupied predominantly by people of a certain racial group? We can look at centralization, which is how close to the center of the region do members of a certain racial group live. And historically, the pattern in American cities is often to have people of color, especially black people, towards the center part of the city, and then white people out into the suburbs. And then the last measurement that we might look at is clustering. So that is, do members of a certain racial group tend to live close to each other, right? Do we see sort of big blobs of people of a certain race? So there's a number of different ways that we can evaluate the levels of residential segregation that exist within a region. So one major reason that residential segregation exists, right, one major reason that we get this sorting of people into different neighborhoods on the basis of race is housing discrimination. And this is significant because housing is one of the most important forms of intergenerational wealth in American society. So a house is often by a good margin the biggest economic asset that a person owns. And people put a lot of money into having real estate, and it's their biggest asset. And then that's something that can be passed down to their children, grandchildren, and so forth, either by literally passing that house down or by passing down the benefits that accumulate from being able to have good, stable housing like that. So housing becomes very important in understanding how discrimination continues through generations, even when sometimes official policies of discrimination have been rescinded or banned. And discrimination is often rationalized as protecting property value. So if your house is your major asset that you own, it becomes very important. It becomes a significant piece of self-interest for you to try to maintain that property value. If the property value of your house goes down, you just lost a lot of money. And that becomes then a reason to rationalize discrimination, because you may say, well, I don't care if, say a black family moves in next door, but I'm just worried that that's going to lower my property value because somebody else isn't going to want to buy my house based on who else is living in that neighborhood. And so we're going to actually see in a lot of different instances the way that concern over protecting property values becomes a reason for people to engage in a variety of activities, and gives them kind of a cover to do things that have discriminatory effects, because they're just concerned about protecting that property value. And they have reason to be concerned about protecting their property value because we're a society in which your house is such a significant asset that you put often quite a lot of money into and want to be able to get that money back out if you were to sell it. So housing discrimination at its sort of rawest can be enacted by the use of overt violence against people of color moving into neighborhoods that are inhabited by white people. So there's a long history of violence used against people of color to maintain the the whiteness of neighborhoods or even entire towns. And so I have a note there about the phenomenon of sundown towns. So these are communities where it was, in some cases, there was an actual law passed back when it was legal to do so, but even more so, just it was kind of made known throughout the community that any people of color, and this was especially directed against black people in most parts of the country, any of them who remained in this town after sundown were opening themselves up to violence. And so we see a lot of communities across the country that are predominantly white today because they have a long history of violently excluding any people who are not white that tried to move in or join that community. Another form of housing discrimination that has gone on is restrictive covenants. So this is a kind of stipulation put on the deed of a house that says that it can't be sold to people of certain racial groups. And the covenants would often target whatever specific group people in that community were most worried about moving in. So in certain areas, they target black people. Certain areas they might target Mexicans or Jews or whatever the group that was people were prejudiced against. And so these restrictive covenants are no longer legally enforceable. They still exist on a lot of deeds of houses, and there are lots of stories of people buying a house and looking over the deed and coming across this stipulation that says, people of their race aren't supposed to be allowed to buy this house, and it's not a legally enforceable thing anymore, but it still exists. And the history of having these restrictive covenants created some of these mostly or all white neighborhoods that have persisted into the present day. And then we have the phenomenon of redlining. So this is a practice in which banks and real estate agents would designate certain areas. They would literally draw red lines on a map as being off limits to buyers from certain races. So they would say that we are not going to offer houses or give mortgages or anything to black people who are trying to buy houses in these particular neighborhoods. We're setting them aside for white buyers. We'll steer our black home buyers into these other neighborhoods. And of course, the areas that were being set aside for white homeowners by this practice were the most desirable areas to live, right? The areas with the best environmental conditions, among other things. And this is a long-standing practice, and I have a note there that we had a major boom in home ownership after World War II due to provisions in the GI Bill that was passed to help the veterans returning from that war. We suddenly had this giant population of veterans, and because of redlining, the ability to benefit from these provisions was going primarily to white veterans. That the black soldiers who had fought alongside them in the same war were not able to take advantage of this bill to get housing that was as good of a quality as their white fellow soldiers were able to, because of the discrimination that was going on by banks and real estate agents. Now, this was made illegal in 1968 by the Fair Housing Act, so it's no longer allowed to actually engage in explicit redlining. However, there are many studies that show that housing discrimination still continues up till the present day. So you can't draw actual red lines on a map anymore, but it's still the case that banks will tend to not give loans to or give worse terms on loans to people of color who are looking to buy houses in traditionally white neighborhoods as compared to the terms that they would give to white prospective buyers. And the real estate agents will steer people towards houses in certain neighborhoods rather than others on the basis of the race of that person. And so these are studies, the sort of best studies are done by creating kind of fake profiles of prospective home buyers that are exactly the same in all the relevant things, credit score and all that, and differ only in the race of the people involved, and then try to get loans or try to get shown houses or even apartments for these people. Sometimes it involves actors going in to actually meet with loan officers and so forth, using these fake credentials that are equalized between the people of different races, and so we can document the worst treatment that is given to prospective homebuyers of color. And so I mentioned, the practice of drawing actual red lines in a map. Here's what that may look like. This is a map of Pittsburgh from back in the days when redlining was legal. And so the areas that are colored in red are the areas that were essentially the black neighborhoods where black home buyers would be able to get a house, and then the yellow are kind of the in-between neighborhoods, and the blue and green are the ones that were being reserved for white home buyers. And you can see that the pattern in this map is very similar to the map that we saw earlier of where people of specific races live today, or in 2010, in Pittsburgh. So the legacy of this continues up through the present day. So we still see the Hill District was an area that was, real estate agents and stuff would allow black people to buy houses in. That still remains a predominantly black neighborhood in Pittsburgh. We see East Liberty here and the north side as other areas that are red on this map and remain predominantly black neighborhoods today. Another set of phenomena that have shaped residential segregation are white flight and gentrification. So white flight is a phenomenon in which white residents moved out into the suburbs of American cities in the middle part of the 20th century. So I mentioned earlier that the typical pattern in the United States is that you tend to have people of color towards the center part of the city and white people out into the outer areas and suburbs. That was produced by this phenomenon of white flight. It was enabled by the spread of the personal automobile. It allowed people to live farther away from where they worked. And so there's this movement of people out into the suburbs. Right? We get highways built, we get new suburbs springing up farther out from cities. And this was attractive because people saw the suburbs as having this cleaner environment than the cities. Right? The cities were seen as dirty and polluted and unpleasant places to live. And so if you can live farther out in the suburbs and commute in, then that was a thing that people wanted to do. But it was mostly white people who were actually successful in moving out into the suburbs because of, first, economic inequalities that existed. So white people were more able to afford housing farther out into the suburbs, and by housing discrimination, that many of these suburbs actively excluded people of color from moving into them, purchasing homes, and so forth. You also had white people being motivated to move out into the suburbs by fears of what were sometimes euphemistically called social problems. So there was an association that they saw between people of color and things like crime. And so having that stereotype, they were essentially afraid to live in areas that had populations of people of color, and they fled that by moving out into the suburbs. So you get this kind of hollowing out of cities. And in addition to creating this residential segregation, right, separating the white people out into the suburbs, leaving the central part of the city to black and Latino and other people of color, this also, because it involved a reduction in the population within the center part of the city, reduced the city's ability to serve the remaining residents. So you'd had this city built up for a larger population, and then a big chunk of your population moves out into the suburbs, and they're no longer paying city taxes, but you still have the full area and infrastructure and everything for the city to maintain. And so environmental quality within the city often actually declined as a result of white flight. The city couldn't maintain the water system and the sewer system, for example, to the same way that they had when they'd had a larger population. And so the environmental conditions then that this population of color that's kind of left behind in the city experience is actually then going to decline. So that's one particular phenomenon creating the spatial pattern of residential segregation that we see in most American cities. Then we have kind of a counterpoint phenomenon that's becoming common today, which is gentrification. And so gentrification occurs when you have an area that has become really economically depressed, that nobody wants to live there, the quality of the housing stock has declined, and so the property values go way down. And eventually at some point some developer comes along and says, I could buy up that property real cheap, renovate it, sell it to a much richer person than whoever is living there right now, and make a good bit of money. So this is now happening. Areas that had been left by white residents during this white flight phenomenon are now attracting white residents back in, who are coming to move into these gentrified areas. And gentrification can happen on kind of a mass scale. If you get whole blocks bought up by a major developer that's going to redo this whole area. And so in Pittsburgh, you see that in places like East Liberty. It's starting to gentrify with large-scale housing developments, often driven by housing workers who are in the tech industry working for Google and companies like that out in that side of the city. It can also happen much more piecemeal, and that's what we're seeing in the north side of Pittsburgh, where rather than one developer buying up a huge chunk of land, you get individual people who can afford to buy these properties and kind of flip these houses. Will buy up just one house at a time. And so until very recently, I lived in the so-called Mexican War Streets neighborhood of Pittsburgh, and the house I lived in was one that was kind of run down, and the landlord didn't pay a lot of attention to it, and so the rent was pretty cheap. But the houses on either side of us had been bought and totally renovated, redone, were worth way more than the house I was living in. And I ultimately ended up having to leave that house because the landlord sold it to a new landlord who saw the potential to renovate it and rent it out to someone for a much higher rent. He wanted to just about double the rent that we were paying, and we decided that even if they totally renovated and gave us like granite countertops and all that kind of stuff, it wasn't worth the money to stay there. So the north side is seeing this kind of piecemeal gentrification. And so when you have this gentrification happening and you're drawing in this richer and generally whiter population to move into an area that had been a low-income area, you see not just this new population moving in, you also see a shift in the amenities available in the neighborhood. So neighborhood is not just houses, it's also stores and restaurants and so forth. And the set of stores and restaurants that you have is going to cater to whoever the population is that lives in that area. And so as you get more of this richer population moving in, you get the kinds of stores and restaurants that might cater to that population, and it becomes a more welcoming kind of environment for them, and then also a less welcoming and less comfortable environment for the people that had lived there before. They're seeing fewer of the kinds of stores and restaurants and things that interest them or that they can even afford to eat at. And so this existing population ends up displaced from this area that's gentrified, and they can no longer afford to live there, and they end up having to go somewhere else. Often they get pushed to a place that is a less desirable area maybe that's farther from jobs, it's farther from public transportation, and so forth. They may also get kind of dispersed, right? If you have a community that exists in an area, it gets gentrified. Those people get pushed out. They don't necessarily all go to the same alternative place. They may scatter throughout the city, and so then that breaks down whatever community that they had formed within that neighborhood. And we have an increasing sort of variant of gentrification that goes by the name green gentrification. And this occurs when areas within a city are redeveloped with specifically an aim towards making them positive environmental amenities that can often attract gentrification to nearby areas. So if a new park is created, for example, and there's a big effort to make this a attractive environmental amenity, something that people want to live near, that then makes the areas around it targets for gentrification, because that new environmental amenity, this park or whatever it is, becomes a thing that people are going to want to live near, and so they're going to be willing to pay more to live near it. A lot of cities have seen this with cleaning up their rivers and waterfronts. So a lot of cities had kind of, for a while, kind of abandoned their rivers as being basically industrial sewers. All the industry is located along the river. They're dumping all their crap in the river. Nobody wanted to live near the river. Well, once they clean up the river and make the river pleasant, put walking trails along it, all that kind of stuff, now the areas near the river become prime real estate, and so they may gentrify really rapidly to take advantage of proximity to that environmental amenity. And so that's green gentrification. Okay, so the last thing that we want to talk about is discriminatory siting. So we've been talking about residential segregation pushing people into different sorts of neighborhoods, and typically bringing white people into the areas that already have the nicest environments, and pushing people of color into the areas that have worse environments. But we also can have problems with new environmental hazards being located in a discriminatory sort of way. So this can take a whole bunch of different sorts of forms. So one form is denial of services to neighborhoods of color. So there are many instances in which something like, say, hookups to the city water system, which can be something very important for maintaining clean water. It's a basic environmental need that people have. The services won't be hooked up to neighborhoods of color. And there may be all kinds of superficially neutral explanations given, right? The city may say, well, we just can't do it because it's too expensive, or the geology there is not right to put in water pipes and these kinds of things. But there have been a lot of analyses showing that these services are kind of systematically more likely to be denied to neighborhoods of color than to white neighborhoods. The cities will go through the trouble to bring water and sewer service, as an example, to white neighborhoods, even if there's cost barriers and stuff, and they won't put that same effort always into bringing these services to neighborhoods of color. We also see governments being slower to act on environmental problems depending on the demographics of the neighborhood that they're in. So if you have toxic sites that the government is considering cleaning up, they may prioritize the ones in white neighborhoods over neighborhoods of color. Or enforcement of environmental laws against facilities that may be polluting their environment. That we see cases in which that enforcement is systematically biased against violations happening in neighborhoods of color. You can also see issues arising from the way that municipal boundaries are drawn. So a lot of this local level environmental quality is overseen by municipal governments, right? A city or town government. And within a metro area, you have things divided up among a bunch of different municipal governments. So, as an example, I live in the borough of Bellevue. I'm located right next to the city of Pittsburgh. If you were driving down, one of the roads that goes through here, like, California Avenue or Route 65, you wouldn't necessarily even notice that you had crossed any sort of boundary when you go from Pittsburgh into Bellevue or vice versa. But they're separate municipal governments, and so that means that my local taxes go to Bellevue, and Bellevue decides what to do with that. And if I were to move just a few blocks over across the border into Pittsburgh, then I'd be paying taxes into Pittsburgh, and I'd be voting for Pittsburgh council members instead of Bellevue council members, and so forth. So how those municipal boundaries are drawn can make a difference to people's environmental quality. So sometimes you'll have a situation in which white communities separate themselves off, create their own separate municipality from the municipality where people of color live in order to hang on to their resources, right, to keep their tax dollars from going towards improving environmental quality, as well as a variety of other sorts of services to the populations of areas near them. And so they'll use that boundary to kind of hoard those resources, keep them within their own community. You also see cases in which municipalities refuse to incorporate nearby communities of color into the municipality. And this is especially noticeable out west, where you often have areas that are not part of any municipal government. So, here in Pennsylvania, wherever you are in some sort of municipality. Okay, so if you're not in the city of Pittsburgh, you're in the borough of Bellevue, or you're in Reserve Township, or Ross Township, or something, right? You've got a local government wherever you are. Out west, it's actually fairly common to have lots of areas that are unincorporated. They don't have a municipal government. Their lowest level of government is the county government. And the counties usually provide a lot fewer services to their residents in unincorporated areas than a municipal government will provide to those residents. And so over time, those cities and towns will incorporate unincorporated areas into them, right? They'll pull those into the municipality and extend services to those areas if they decide that area has enough people and it's worth pulling them into under this umbrella of the municipal government. And so sometimes areas will be denied incorporation as a way to avoid providing services to them. And that's a thing that can be done in a discriminatory way, that communities of color can be excluded from those benefits. And then the last thing to note here is that communities of color are often areas that have less political clout. So they can then become targeted by people who are looking to locate some sort of environmentally negative facility, one of these locally unwanted land uses or LULUs. People citing these will look for where's the easiest place we can put it, right? Where's the place we're going to have to spend the least on lawyers fighting over whether we're allowed to put it here. And they may see communities of color as the path of least resistance, that these areas have less political power, will be able to put up less of a fight if they put this facility into that area. So we can see some of these different processes then that create residential segregation among people of different races, and that then unequally allocate the positive and negative aspects of the environment to these areas. So that is part 1 of our discussion of environmental racism, and we'll be back next week for part 2 of our discussion of environmental racism.